Thank you very much for the introduction and also for the opportunity to address you. Let me begin by thanking my friend Magali for this curious invitation, which I will explain in a moment. And I must also, of course, thank the Center for Population, Office of Population Research, and also for the CDDA for the collaboration in organizing this and arranging for me to be present today. It's a pleasure and an honor. But I must say I'm struck by the photograph because, as you rightly said, I've spent a lot of my career involved in dealing with political conflicts, and specifically the intersection of peace and justice, of movement from violence or violent situations to less violent, hopefully more sustainable peace situations. I'll mention about that in a moment, but I have two quick observations on the photograph, because if one took a quick look at that photograph, it could be many places in the world. And I can tell you that I've spent a lot of the last 2 years working, for example, in Yemen, a completely different place than Venezuela. But you would see almost identical photographs of masses of people on the streets and in the squares of their societies, of their countries. This was the case all across, of course, famously the Arab Spring. We saw it in Cairo, in Tunis, and many other places. But we also see it very recently in other parts of the world, in Kiev, in Ukraine. Of course, people power and the reactions are almost synonymous with the Philippines, and so really all regions of the world. And I want to draw your attention to this because I think there are two important implications of a general nature. The first is that the classic idea of international relations and law, that authority, a respected authority between states, turned on effective control, essentially the use of force, is no longer sufficient. And in fact, in contrast to the norm of effective control, we are increasingly treating the subject or trying to engage with the notion of legitimacy of authority, not just effective control. That's a quite different notion, which is, I think, essential to our reflections. And the second is, even in terms of democratic governance, as a form of legitimization of authority, we are no longer satisfied by the mere electoral success or victory of individual parties. We are now increasingly interested in the quality of governance. Again, a fundamental shift in our understanding. I would even go so far as to say we are living through a period of what I sometimes call a post-Westphalian flux or shift in paradigm in terms of global international relations. Now, I come to you today with without experience in Venezuela or even really in South America, and by my own standards of professional conduct, I should have really declined to address you today. But Magali convinced me, and she did so based on my 30 years of experience, and specifically 20 years working for intergovernmental organizations, 10 or 11 with the United Nations and 9 with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, in almost all parts of the world, through many different situations. I won't bore you with that. But which have led me to be conscious of not only good practices well beyond scholarly interpretation, but what works, not just what's just, but what works. And perhaps, therefore, to share some of those reflections that you might draw some applicability from. And I do so conscious that, above all, context is paramount, that the devil is in the details of any situation. So I will hesitate to say anything. In fact, I will say very little about Venezuela. I hope that you can draw from my remarks the applicability. As I say, still Magali invited me as a friend with a simple idea, that it might be perhaps useful at this point in the developments in Venezuela to hear an outsider's view, and I am very much an outsider in this regard. Now, I'm going to synthesize from a variety of experiences and a number of situations which are arguably worse than Venezuela in terms of violence, complexity, absence of natural endowments, and other attributes of the situation. But maybe they'll offer some ideas which can be borrowed or adapted, and I hope stimulate reflections. I hope, in addition, they might suggest some options through which effective discussions or dialogue can be pursued in Venezuela to move away from violence and towards sustainable peace and development. And that's the hope with which I offer these reflections with humility. The title of my address is Preventing Violence in Venezuela, Considerations for an Effective Dialogue. And I'll begin with violence. The idea of preventing or reducing violence is probably counter-historical, probably counterintuitive in terms of the human experience. We are a bloody species. We are not good at doing or living in peace. We are remarkable as a species comparative to others at our capacity to do harm to ourselves. And there's much to be said about this. I would dare say, without much scholarly reflection, but more practical experience, that when people want to fight and kill, it's difficult to stop them. And I fear this is the case right now in situations like Syria or Mali, possibly, and I fear, becoming in Ukraine, and I hope it's not the situation in Venezuela. Last month, I attended an interesting conference organized by a group called Beyond Conflict, hosted at MIT at the Sachs Lab of the Brain Institute, which drew a few things to my attention I'm not used to observing, sitting with neurologists and neuroscientists and others. And the first was the observation that humans are hardwired neurologically with deep instincts such that we feel before we think. I think we like in the academy to think we are rational human beings and we make determinations and we calculate. It appears that's less the case than the reality. We feel before we think. And we do that in biological terms. We are not merely emotional in a social psychological sense and even irrational, but biologically, the concept of fear, deep-rooted in human instinct, literally creates physiological responses that manifest outputs or actions of fight or flight. These are the natural, immediate, instinctual reactions to fear. We do so also in terms of competition for survival, competition for prestige, and similar forms of engagement with our fellow human beings. There are other attributes of this, social and sexual. Concepts of, I think, somewhat knowledgeable in your part of the world, ideas of machismo, I'm reminded of the work of the Scottish historian Ray Tannehill, who wrote two fascinating books, one on food in history and the other on sex in history, really exploring human development in terms of two fundamental instincts, the instinct for immediate survival and self-generation and procreation, and the other for social through intergenerational development. And these are very raw ideas. I note so much when I mention this last idea, and that we're not necessarily talking about women and men, although there are certainly important points to be made there, but probably more so about gender, about social constructions and roles in our societies which have important effects. In addition to this are narratives, the social and the psychological ways in which we recount our historical experience, we tell stories, and we believe them. And then on top of this are norms and values by which we judge, by which we may decide our conduct, and we structure our relations and our actions. In all of this, history is replete with violence. So it's not easy to talk about how do we turn away from violence and towards sustainable peace and development. In fact, to counter violence is a difficult and often thankless task. To create just and prosperous societies in the context of constant violence is particularly difficult. To find the time, the space, the opportunities for peace building, peacemaking. War, by its nature, and forms of conflict like war, have often been defined as the negation of human rights, the the absence of dignity, and well known to incur enormous costs, both of human lives and material losses. So it's difficult to develop beyond war. Therefore, efforts to create peace and to create peaceful and prosperous societies with sustainable peace and development are to be prized, and the opportunities that may pronounce themselves are to be seized. Now, without painting an entirely negative picture, it is worth noting that as a species we appear to be getting better at making peace and building peace. We do know more and more how to do it. We have been learning from our experiences. An important contextual or conceptual framework for this has been offered by the Norwegian sociologist Johan Galtung, who invoked the notion of negative peace versus positive peace. The idea of stopping violence as one set of actions, one set of initiatives, creating the non-physical threats, and moving then to another form of what he called positive peace, with resilient societies capable of self-generating human development. There are, in this sense, physical and social attributes of peace, not only to be physically and personally secure and able individually and socially to conduct our daily lives, to walk, to work, to rest, to play, but also to plan and to invest freely and with confidence in ourselves, our families, and our communities. It's towards this kind of societal, even civilizational progress that I'd like to talk about forms of dialogue. A last point before moving to dialogue. I mentioned that we're living, I think, in some kind of post-Westphalian flux. But in the historical development of international relations and human development, we can't avoid acknowledging the important, what I would call revolutionary development of the United Nations Charter and the contemporary, what is sometimes called constitutional global order, or quasi-constitutional order, which begins, we should never forget, in the preamble of the Charter with the phrase, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. This is the fundamental raison d'etre of the structures we're developing, to move away from violence towards peace. In Venezuela, it seems inescapable from the daily news and reports that appear increasingly on our televisions and on the social media, that violence is widespread, endemic, and getting worse. It's not only a risk of civil war, but of chaos. So to seek to reverse this trend and to turn around from a vicious to a virtuous cycle, we have to reflect upon what negative peace would imply and then what positive peace may portend. It's clear, and this is the importance of dialogue, it's clear we cannot do that without talking. At some point and in some ways, we need to talk, not just amongst ourselves, but with our enemies, with those with whom we are in competition, in contestation, and opposed. If there is any prospect of a new social contract, of new social justice, of new dynamic, peaceful, and prosperous societies, then we must begin to talk. Now, my main topic today about preventing violence in Venezuela is more about some considerations for an effective dialogue. And let me begin by saying that dialogue is not to be confused with either the technical or notional idea of mediation. I want to distinguish that initially. Mediation, which is a more advanced form of talking, usually with a third party or an intermediary, often in a technical, sometimes a formal format, sometimes with pre-agreed ideas of outcomes, a mediated outcome, and so forth. By contrast, dialogue, and I focus today on dialogue, is another form of talking, a form of exchange and of with not only pronouncement of position, of view, but also of reception, of listening, a dialogic process. There can be different forms of dialogue, and it's important to note that the decisions with regard to the design and the conduct, the structuring of dialogue, make or break its success. how one designs or how one proceeds. And I want to again say that while there may be elements of that form of dialogue that may include negotiation, initially you may, and I would urge you begin dialogue without negotiation, without even the prospect of negotiation. That it is not so conditioned on any outcome, on in fact nothing beyond the mere benefit of dialogue itself. So what are the first steps? An effective dialogue requires spaces and environments for exchange. Spaces which are safe, within which confidences may be exchanged, where ideas may be floated, kites flown, as we sometimes say. Without fear, without favor. They offer places and spaces to have a say, without shouting. They imply and require minimum degrees of respect and recognition, because that's the basis to be heard, not to shout, not to assert, but to exchange. And perhaps an effective dialogue can engender the result of being understood, which is something much more deep than merely to exchange. There may or not be some intended effects in terms of outcomes, in terms of actions. In my experience, an effective dialogue enriches per se. What are the purposes then of such a dialogue? First of all, to learn. Can we learn from each other? Can we explore together? Can we, in the process, develop relations, potentially rapport, together engaging in some sense of a shared future, a shared situation, and only possibly, maybe, also together decide upon that future. Now, it's not obvious or easily done, and therefore I'd like to reflect on a few of the ideas of how to do an effective dialogue. In the first place, it's often not possible for protagonists, for people killing each other, to sit down, organize, and conduct their own dialogue. It simply doesn't happen. They need help. Often protagonists need and require help. There's an absence of trust. There's an absence of capacity. In fact, capacity is often the fundamental stumbling point. Even if there's willingness, who can really provide this or initiate it, and the roles to be played are important questions to answer. In this regard, it is often useful to have an intermediary. I don't say a mediator, but an intermediary. Someone who can facilitate, convene, assure the parameters, perhaps assist, even in capacity building, knowledge transfer, skills development, and so forth. Certainly with logistics, certainly with other elements, and to do so in a dispassionate and expert way. There are 5 elements to this. The first order are process-related. To design a process and to implement it, to answer the questions, who shall be the participants? Who shall be the intermediary? Will there or not be observers or other participants? Second question would be where? Where in space and place might this be conducted? Physically or through other means? Would it be local, inside the conflict, outside the conflict? Would it be in a neutral space? These are, again, important questions. And then there are the questions of how will such a dialogue be conducted? Will it be large or small? Will it be with all interested or affected parties or only some and selected ones? Will it be open or closed? Will it be a one-off event or will it be some kind of intended progression of exchange? And what will be the rules? And I want to emphasize the importance of rules for the conduct of such a dialogue, because this is also the basis of eventually a rule-respecting society. In addition, there are the substantive, not the process elements, but the substantive elements, a second order of organizing an effective dialogue. In the first place, the question must be about what the dialogue will address. What will be the agenda? What are the topics or issues of concern? Are they general or precise? And what will be the ordering or sequence of that dialogue? Will it be retrospective or prospective or both? And ultimately, to which end will this dialogue be held? what outputs or outcomes are imagined. As I've emphasized already, in my view, an effective dialogue may merely be for its own sake, for the initial values of exchange. In terms of process, I'd like to add a few other reflections. One of the most important ideas is that of inclusivity or inclusion, increasingly considered an essential value of an effective dialogue. There are variables for any such dialogue, whether to limit it merely to the protagonists and more so those with arms, or to enlarge it to include those who are definitely interested, maybe also those who are affected, and possibly also those who may be influential, but not necessarily interested in the sense of the outcomes, but could help. In this regard, there has been increasing practice of widening the circle, or having concentric circles of dialogue processes, and certainly to include factors or movements in society, such as women, such as youth, which bring in generational or gender perspectives, or such as civil society, such as it may evolve in different contexts. A second area of consideration is the notion of tracks, or multiple. I would suggest you think here now in terms of geometry, not just of concentric circles, but of tracks or levels and the interrelationship between them. Whether the dialogue is official or between officials, whether it is non-official, whether it is community-based, and increasingly, whether there are linkages between these tracks. So there are multidimensional, parallel, simultaneous, and often interlinked dialogue processes. And importantly, whether these would be quiet or public. On substance, there are some remarks also to be shared briefly. First of all, conflicts as such are normal in any human experience. We compete over space, resources, and opportunities, prestige, and so forth. So it's not a matter necessarily, in fact, I consider it oxymoronic in a number of situations, to talk about resolving the conflict as if it will be forever resolved and ne'er in the future arise. Much more is the challenge of managing situations where conflicts are by their nature present. As I say, competition, for example, over scarce resources or their usages. And in that regard, not to ignore those sources of conflict, but to engage with them and to find effective ways of dealing with them, and to do so without violence. So how to manage becomes a very important question. What are those specific issues? And are they of an order of root cause of the conflict or incidental to the conflict? This is very important because usually protagonists or parties enter into dialogue or prosecute their conflict from their unique perspective. And an intermediary can in fact perform a crucial function in framing or reframing the conflict in ways which make it more manageable, less violent. In other words, how to talk about the issues is one of the issues. And not a priori to suggest in this regard a specific outcome, but to engage with different conflicts without a determined idea of the outcome and to problem solve as one proceeds. This is often a crucial part of a successful dialogue. Now, just to say that there is evident complexity in every society and in every type of dialogue. Its size, its time, the tensions that exist, challenges of prestige, costs, material and other, and risks, all of which mitigate against effective dialogues, but have to be dealt with. The crucial point, in my view, is to start, is to begin, and to sustain it without a prejudiced idea of an outcome. In this regard, norms matter. And I'd like to say a word about the distinction between neutrality and impartiality. There are universal norms, such as with regard to basic human dignity, the value of life per se, but also norms of rationality, of reasonableness, rules of conduct, of social and cultural respect, and ideas about reliability, credibility, and other notions which contribute to success. Eventually, we can talk about law, but not initially. In this regard, I would like to suggest that an effective intermediary need not be neutral, in fact should not be neutral with regard to the outcomes. They may share those values. For example, they want an outcome that respects human life. They are decidedly not in favor of genocide, decidedly not in favor of torture, and so forth. These are normative parameters. But it is important that they be impartial with regard to the parties, that they not share an interest with the party or parties in the outcome. I believe that otherwise, that would be to put the cart before the horse to start to suggest ideas. And in that regard, I just say a word about crime or criminality. In my experience, it is not the first order of consideration. It may be either incidental to or even causal in the sense of the conflict. But an effort to deal with criminality as a first order is probably not an effective step for dialogue. I would suggest more pragmatism should be prized, and issues of criminality usually can be dealt with in the due course of time. I don't have time to discuss examples. I'd be happy to in the course of some exchange in the day. But certainly we can talk about a range of processes from quiet diplomacy in the Oslo talks regarding Israel-Palestine. We can talk about many examples in which I've worked. We can talk about national dialogues as structured, formal, comprehensive structures in Somalia, Yemen, many countries, and so forth, Myanmar, and so many parts of the world. But in Venezuela, allow me just a couple of words with the humility and understanding that I know little about the country. I must say it's remarkable, even curious and odd, that Mr. Maduro has issued a public statement inviting a dialogue. That is not a normal conduct of a state. And I would say that while it is certainly unclear what was the basis of that, the initiation, and what he has in mind, and I would suggest that it is reasonable to have doubts about motivations. It is merited to have hesitancy. Still, I would remark on the curious nature of that initiative. And I would suggest that it offers some possibility, some sliver of light, which is rare, and I would suggest to be seized and to be built upon. I hope I'm not being naive in suggesting that. And I'm glad to see that there has been such an initiative, a response or action by the Pope, and I understand by some others. And I would suggest to enter into such a dialogue, one need not be naive in terms of the difficulties, challenges, or risks, but still worth endeavoring. And that's really where I'd like to end my remarks. My observation, although I've never been to Venezuela, is that it appears that Venezuela is a rich country, a naturally endowed state, rich in its people and its culture. And it should be resilient. It should be dynamic. It should be an example of peace and prosperity. It could become an example of how to move towards that vision, to overcome the challenges. But it needs to begin by talking, and it needs to begin sooner than later. Thank you very much.